Now we're going to talk about conservation and preservation. Now, this is a very cautious, because I'm not a conservator, and the advice from conservators is less is more, less is best. If we talk about conservation, we're talking about intervention. Now, conservation is taken generally at the item, individual item, or a small collection of records. You are intervening, and sometimes you can never go back. You can't undo what's been done. So what conservatives say is less is best. And if you're doing anything complex, get a trained conservator. There is a society, and it would be best to do that. You can do some simple things, but preservation, we consider preservation strategies a better bet. So preservation means that you've got all those things in place, and we've talked about them because storage, proper storage, is a preservation strategy. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing anything other than removing the dust from records when they come into your collection, carefully removing the dust, putting them between acid-free sheets of paper. I think we've talked about that in the handout. Putting them in archival boxes, whether they are cardboard, traditional cardboard boxes, or one of the other things that are available now. Doing all those things, having your area itself cleaned, having a maintenance program, cleaning program, pest, all those sort of things we've talked about, they're all preservation. And that applies whether or not you're talking about your records that are just your day-to-day operational records that you might throw out at the end of the year. You might keep your main series of correspondence, but you probably won't keep the rosters for your volunteers. But having them properly looked after, if you want to keep them for that year or even 2 years, you want to keep them properly so that you can go and get them again. So it's looking at surveying the collection, and that's the other thing. It's getting to know that collection. Because whether it's a giant collection of 67 kilometres like state records, or it's a small collection, things change. You might have had a lot of rain. I keep coming back to that, but that's an issue. That could have affected what's happening. You might have had a collection that had a bit of mould. You might have paid to have some treatment done. Go back and make sure the mould hasn't come back. Mould is really, really insidious and hard to get rid of. So these are some of the things that you need to think about with a preservation program. Knowing your collection. And then these preventative things. Now, I'm not going to spend a long time on any of these, but I'm just going to mention them. Security, we've talked about that. The basics of security. A back-to-base system would be fantastic, but having things locked up, having cabinets locked up within rooms, having a proper system with keys so that you're not giving out your keys holus bolus, that you know who's got the keys. Environmental control as much as you possibly can achieve on whatever budget you have at your disposal. Maintenance, cleaning, checking, handling, proper procedures in place so that not just when the material comes in, but when you're using it, when you're researchers or when someone's coming in to view it, that you have proper procedures so that if you've got heavy big volumes, the simplest thing is to have them rest on a pillow with the styrofoam just sitting there. It's not doing any intervention, it's not hurting anything, but it's resting. It's a nice gentle way for the book to rest, and it won't put strain on the spine. Copying, thinking about copying. Don't allow copying where you have to literally throw it onto the photocopier. Say to people if they want copying from particular categories of records, only with a digital camera, non-invasive and no flash. Things like that. Disaster preparedness, we've talked about that. And I will mention a little bit about conservation intervention. Not about how to do it, because I'm not a conservator. I'm going to tell you, though, where you can find out a little bit about what you can do, an education. Now, knowing the collection is the building, of course. We've talked about that. But one of the things that you might consider is this one, is a survey. You might decide that as one of your business plan, part of your business plan for the next 12 months might be that you do a survey of your collection. Look at the format. You might have a whole lot of oral history tapes on cassette tapes. That technology is dying. Now, don't be tempted to run along to the local man down the street and he said he'll put them on a CD. Okay, that's fine. What happens when CDs are no longer the latest technology, you can damage CDs. If you're going to migrate, and that's what the term that we use, if you're going to migrate from one form to another, think about the inherent risks in going to that. So that if, for example, you're going audio tapes and you're going to put them onto a DVD, think about also backing up on a portable hard drive where you've got somewhere that you can store them. Think too whether the local library might be interested in having a copy so that you've got a backup of a backup. And then think about documenting, which you must do when you've taken that intervention from the original cassette tape to the DVD. With format, paper is fantastic. As long as you look after paper, it'll last for ages. Photos, not too bad, but there are issues there, not too bad, you can manage that. But with digital technology, you have to be totally on top, because it is so easy to think that we've copied them across, we've copied our movie film across, or we've copied our sound recordings. Okay, that's fine for this week, but next week we're going to have to think about what else we do. So that's where belonging to organisations, for example, such as the Oral History Association, where they run workshops on things like how you migrate your data over time. Think about workshops that institutions such as the State Library of New South Wales run on those sorts of questions. Lots of other talks and sessions are provided, the National Library in Canberra, because it's an issue that we all face. It's not just your local society. For example, some years ago, someone donated to me, or to us, to State Records, an index on floppy disks. DBase 4 was the program. That was a problem in itself. Finding a computer with a hole for a floppy disk. I think we eventually found one. Then there are those little ones, then you get those big ones, Buckleys and none. So you just need to be think cautiously. I mean, that is one of those problems about databases and everything else that we need to be very mindful of. There's a lot of material on the State Records website. I know if for anyone who is interested, we prepare it for government. A lot of the information that we prepare is for government. The information is exactly the same. It's the same as whether you're applying it for the Department of Primary Industry or you're applying it to a local community group. Issues about migration, issues about databases, issues about what you do with your digital records. How many of you have electronic or have databases on a computer? Lots. You do your correspondence, you write your letters on a computer, you have them backed up on a computer, all of those sorts of things. And we'll be talking later about using computers to create databases. But you have to be very careful about having all those strategies in place. Now, a preservation survey, these are the kinds of things that you would do, and I would suggest that everyone does this. I mean, we at State Records do it. Of course, it takes a lot longer with such a large collection, but you're looking at who is doing it, the date, the location of the collection, the type, and the format is so important there, the condition. So if you notice that the CDs, the DVDs are looking a bit strange, you have to do something there and then, otherwise you might lose everything. The storage containers, have they been damaged? Think about future access. Is the format, the way the records are presented, going to be appropriate if you want to provide access to them? And suggested action and priority. Now, one of the great things is, great news, that the Royal Australian Historical Society does give money to societies to conduct preservation surveys. And I've got some handouts here for everyone, not on how to apply, but information on the grants. So I might just pass those around. Please grab one and pass them along.
The National Library also.
National Library also, that's right. They give a lot more money, and that's another source as well. Preventative strategies can include looking at the environment. The papers themselves or the collection itself can have inherent problems. It can be very fragile. It could have, as I've mentioned, mould. It could have had other things wrong with it. Now, we can't do much about that other than to stabilise, store very carefully in acid-free containers and so on. The most important way of preserving is to have a level of care for the whole of the collection. I mean, photocopying is one strategy, but it should always be done on acid-free or low-acid paper. And unfortunately, of course, a lot of photocopying in the olden days was done on that paper that was shiny and strange. It gave off a very weird chemical smell. So we need to be careful about that. But these are some of the things you'll need to consider. Security, we've talked about that, is actually assessing the risk. Not just saying, oh, it's all safe, but thinking, well, what could someone do? What could someone do? Or what could happen? The environmental control, is it appropriate to the holdings? Is it stable? Looking at the storage areas. Pest management, and having that done regularly. Good general housekeeping, making sure there's no rubbish left there after you've been open. General handling guidelines, I've got those in your handout. Preservation copying. You can copy for access. We microfilm so that we can make records accessible, and also so that they can be protected. We talk about reformatting to avoid obsolescence, and reformatting because of the inherent instability. So if you're given something in electronic format, and it might be that you're given a collection of photographs, not on photographic paper, but on a digital CD. So think about what you're going to do with those. Disaster preparedness, we've talked about that, and that is part of looking at your collection, doing the survey, because ultimately that's one of the things that needs to be considered. Now, as I mentioned, Archives Outside, which is on our website, on the State Records website, and that has been developed as a meeting place. We call it literally a meeting place for people who are collectors who run collections of archives. And there is a whole section there along the top, on the navigation bar along the top, under Preservation. If you click on that, and you'll see there that we've done 8 conservation tips. Now, most of these are very simple tips on how to do things, which low levels of intervention. Whatever you do, it's going to be minimal potential damage, but bearing in mind that any time you try to intervene, you run the risk, so you always need to be very cautious. Sticky tape is the bane of everyone's lives. So often things were restored with sticky tape, and it is of course incredibly difficult to get rid of. Storage, simply by storing things properly, we're protecting them. Removing blood from paper documents, that's a good one, but it's really to do with, and of course it can happen, that you're taking clips, sharp clips out of documents, might cut your finger. So just be careful there. Mould, wet records, etc. So each of these has a posting on the Archives Outside blog, and they go through step by step. And with the sticky tape removal, I've actually printed that in your handout, and that's been prepared by our Senior Conservator, Elizabeth Hadlow. So look at it carefully and consider very carefully whether you want to do that intervention or whether you might try and get a grant to do something along those lines. Storage of large documents and plans. So there's some tips there about that. Removing blood, I've mentioned. Blood is best removed when it is still wet and fresh. Very right, actually. A method of rehousing glass plate negatives. Now, someone asked me before about 35mm negatives, but this is advice on glass plates, so some good advice there. Removing mould, wet records. Those stands that you can get for putting your washing on, things like that can be quite helpful. They're just simple, you can buy them from the supermarket. I think this stand here has probably been done with plastic coated wire to make a section where things can dry. Upright storage for books, simple things like that rather than having them flat. And then we've got some guidance on how you could make a cover to hold your book, to protect it, your volumes. Removing chewing gum. Yeah, but things like that. Now, education in terms of your clients, people using your collection, being aware of how important it is to handle things properly. And one of the things that State Records has is a flyer called How to Handle State Archives. By all means, you can use that, use the information from there, because it talks about why we ask people to do certain things. That's part of education. When you're having someone come to visit your collection, your institution, your historic house, having all those sorts of things in place, saying, look, this is what we do. We did our preservation survey. We've got these leaflets. They can be just simple things that you've run off on the photocopier about how to handle our collection. It gives your collection a value. It imbues immediately that people think, this collection must be pretty special. It's not just some bits of old paper. It's some wonderful things that this group of people feel is so important that it needs to be handled properly. And that becomes then quite an important selling point. If your local councillor comes in and you say, oh, well, before you handle that, would you like to put these gloves on? If the councillor says no, and you say, oh, well, here we are, we'll just maybe wash the hands first, or I'll turn them over for you because these are very important. All those sorts of nice things that people remember. Okay, the Australian Institute for the Conservation of Cultural Material has a list of conservators. That is the professional body, and they have a list of conservators. You can contact them. There's some information there about finding conservators. Now, community heritage grants. The National Library of Australia has community heritage grants. I think the current round, it says there, it's closed, but it's annual, and keep an eye out for that. Have a look at the website and see when the round will start next year. And you can get up to $10,000. You can get, initially, what they insist on, or what they want, is to have a preservation survey conducted. You can get that done by one of the grants from the Royal Australian Historical Society. Once you've got your preservation survey in place, you can then start applying for grants to do the work, perhaps, or tasks identified within your preservation survey. So it's a two-step process, but very important. And of course, once you've got your preservation survey, you can go along to other grant bodies or other potential sponsors and see if they'll give you some money. Now, I only show you this so that you remember for next time. Think about the National Library and the Community Heritage Grants. The Royal Australian Historical Society, I've just given you the handout from them. Their round of grant applications, I should say, has just opened. So think about that. That's another source. And you can put in there. They have a bit more money this year, so you never know, you might be successful. And they close on the 20th of July. Again, keeping archives. So with preservation, with conservation, intervene as little as possible. Aim to preserve your collection in the first instance. And the preservation is by having all those things in place that we've talked about. Having the right building, having the right environment, having the right practices when records come in, having a collection policy that allows us to say, no, I do not want that greasy thing because it'll make a mess all over the place and we'll end up falling all over. It'll be an occupation or health and safety issue for our volunteers, and we'll end up getting grease everywhere. So they're all the sorts of things you need to do. Having processes in place for donors, having processes in place to be able to say to a donor, look, yes, we do love having this particular object, but if a better version or a better type or one that's less damaged comes along, we want you to agree, we want you to be aware that we may well dispose of it. So donors don't expect that you're going to keep something in perpetuity, and that's the hardest thing to say. And that comes back to having a policy, an upfront policy that says, look, we can't guarantee in perpetuity. If we want things, we will accept them, and having a policy in place so that people know that and it's documented. So having all of those sorts of things, the accession register, whether it's a volume or a piece of paper or a computer, and having a strategy to look at about the changing format of records, having all those things in place, that's what gives us our preservation strategy. For conservation, we think of particular things that warrant attention, and maybe we try and get a grant to get the minute books for the local Surf Life Saving Association conserved because they've got sticky tape all over them, but we won't try and do too much ourselves. We'll keep it clean, keep the dust off, keep the pests down. All right, well, what we'll do is go on to the next session, which is database development, which will be a short session, and then we'll talk about digitisation, and at the very end we'll just talk a little bit about access policies. Now, when we talk about archival collection management systems, it sounds a bit, you think, well, I don't really want that. I just want to know about databases. Well, that's fine too. We just call them databases. But why we might have a management system is to be able to allow us to manage the collection better by having information about the collection in a form that is generally electronic, but these days it pretty well always is. It makes it more accessible because you might decide that you want to be able to put a bit of information about your collection on the internet. Maybe not the photos themselves, but the information that you have the photos. And it also might make the collection more usable. So a collection management system can describe your records, it can help you manage them. It can produce reports which are information about the collection. It allows you, by making those reports, which could be paper-based or they could be something on a CD or attached to an email, you might be able to share that with another organisation. Compare, not because you want to split up your collection, but you might want to say, well, okay, these people have this information about this organisation or this building. You might sort of see, compare and contrast, see what's there. And it can provide, as we say, context, and more context. It can bring together all those things that I was talking about, the who, the when, the why, the provenance. So we don't just have this single bunch of files. We have all this information about them, and they can grow, they can expand. But you do need to be aware that whatever system you use, with technology and technological changes, that you're going to have to think about migration strategies. They mightn't cost very much, but as each version of Windows, of Excel or whatever else happens over time, you need to make sure that you're keeping pace with that. And that is a small financial commitment, and I know for many organisations that is an issue, but there are often other ways. You might get some local assistance with that, but you need to be aware. So it can describe your records, your physical records, your digital records, your objects and your images. Now, when we talk about disposal requirements, that can be still appropriate because you have management records to do with the management of your society, don't you? Do you keep everything? Do you keep everything that's created that your society creates? Every scrap of paper, every telephone inquiry? No, just like us, just like government. You keep the important things. You keep the correspondence, you keep your minutes, donor forms, accession records, but you don't necessarily keep a record that Joan was in on Friday and left the scones for Marge to pick up on Saturday. It's important at the time, but we won't keep it permanently. The system allows you immediately to record any security requirements. Are the records, because they are confidential, should they not be generally accessible? Did we get an agreement that the records came from the local council? It sometimes happens, and that from time to time someone from council might come and look at them. It allows you to manage preservation. It allows you to document where work is required, preservation, conservation is required, allows you to document that. It also allows you to coordinate loans, because sometimes, and I know my own historical society, the local library is always borrowing things from us to display, which is very nice. But it's important to document that those things have gone out on loan. It's an agreement. We're in council premises, but there's no embargo on us having proper systems in place that document that the local library downstairs has borrowed these objects, they sign for them, and then we sign again when they come back, so that it's all documented. And then, of course, usage generally. Nice to be able to say, again, when the councillor comes to visit or the local dignitary comes to visit your collection, you can say, we had 400 users last year, 600 telephone inquiries. You might have a lot more, things like that. So think about these systems. You put the data in and you can reuse it in a variety of different ways over and over again. You can share the information, and one of the great ways of sharing information, and I think this is a terrific system, is through Picture Australia, which is hosted on the National Library's website. Now that's one way, that's a cheap and easy way if you've got photographs you can put them up on there. You know, sometimes you'll get someone who'll come back to you and say, didn't you know that was 1940? Couldn't you tell because of the car or the fashion or something else? You know, I mean, and very helpful. The other thing too is that it does allow you to give more information about the collection. Bring the data that you've got all together so that you know when the donation came in, who donated it, and the other conditions, if there are any. So they can be flexible, they can grow, and they can be developed between institutions and organisations. There's a couple of examples. We say spreadsheets not good, I tend to agree. Library and museum systems I don't think are particularly helpful, but there is a terrific product, a freeware called Tabularium. That's a very good system. The web address is in your handout, and that works very well for small collections. Allows you to describe things and to record the necessary information. So if you're going to implement a collection management system, collect all your documentation together. Think about what you're actually wanting and what you've actually got. Think how you're going to use that information. Think how your users are going to want that information presented to them. Think about the technicalities. One of the great things is you think, now I love computers, and when I talk to groups sometimes I'll say, all the information's on the website, and they say, I don't use a computer. So think about that too, that you might have volunteers who are really scared of using a computer. So maybe what they do in terms of collection management systems is they prepare the written documentation, which can then be used for inputting. You might get someone who's really good on the inputting, and plan for the future. Think about migration, think about the system in the future. So these are all, I guess, just tips and tactics. It's free, you can produce finding aids, it's cost effective, and it helps you manage your collection effectively. But you have to be committed. It does mean that someone has to be in charge, I guess, of the implementation, and someone else run with it, so over time. Back up on your own computer. I have these arguments with my own husband about typing things. He's doing some university stuff. He's gone back and he's doing a course just for interest. And I tell him, keep on backing up. He said, oh, doesn't the computer back up itself? Well, no, it does not. So yes, back up onto the computer itself. Buy an external hard drive, back up on that, back up on CDs. Yeah, memory sticks, yep. Memory sticks are fine too, yeah, back up on those. Have as many backup systems as possible, and and have them stored in different places. Again, coming back to keeping archives, there's a lot of information in there, and if you are a member of the Royal Australian Historical Society, there is an article in the latest issue, in the June issue of the History magazine, which deals with the development of databases and archival data. And that was prepared by Dr. Kate Cumming from State Records, and I acknowledge and thank Kate for preparing the slides for this section of the talk. But basically we're talking here about a tool which allows you to manipulate the data in ways that you never would be able to do in the old paper-based system. But having that capacity to manipulate the data means that you also have the capacity to wipe it, to lose it, to have hard drive failure, and everything else in between. So back up, and back up. And if you have paper systems that you use to do your accessioning and everything else, keep those. Don't just toss them out and say it's all on the computer.
Yes.
Because yes, it might all be on the computer. They're the sort of things you keep, and you keep very carefully. Now, I'm very fortunate today to have a colleague, Rhonda Campbell, who is going to be the acting Manager Public Access when I retire at the end of June. Rhonda was previously in charge of digitisation at State Records, and I was delighted when I said, rather tentatively I have to say, Rhonda, would you mind doing the session today on digitisation? She said no, so I was delighted. I know we haven't had clapping, but please join me in welcoming. Thank you.
So as Chris said, I'm going to talk to you about digitising your collection. Now, how many people here already digitise part of their collections? Just a few. Okay, successfully? Sort of. So what is digitisation? Digitisation refers to the conversion of non-digital material to a digital form. So that can mean anything from maps, manuscripts, moving images and sound as well. But mainly today we're dealing with paper documents, volumes, maps related to that. Moving images and sounds, that's specialised digitisation, and it really needs to be outsourced and gone to specialised companies. So I'll just tell you about our in-house digitisation program. We have a planned digitisation projects which are by series, and Chris has already mentioned the word series to you. So we'll have a series of photographs relating to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So we'll do that complete series as a complete series, so it all goes up onto Photo Investigator. We also do selection by theme, for instance, crime and punishment. We'll grab particular records from different series that relate to crime and punishment and do a little digital exhibition, so to speak, which would appear in our digital gallery, which is on our website. We also do external requests through our reading room. People may see an image on our website and request a copy of that image, so we do that as well. Or also they'll come into our reading room and look at a particular document and request a digital copy of that document. We also do images for publications, exhibitions. Sometimes we won't, for various reasons, allow the original record to go out on loan, so we'll do a very high quality digital copy of that, and then they'll make a print and put that on display rather than the original document. Internal requests for online content, staff use, promotional material, and also conservation, to document conservation repair on a particular record, so we get the before and after shot of what it looked like before the treatment and then after the treatment, so it's a good pictorial record of what happened to that document. And also again with loans, we photograph or digitise a record before it goes out on loan, so when it comes back we can see if there's been any change in the record. Usually there's not, because institutions are very good that we loan to. The equipment that we use are Microtext scanners, which are A4 size, and also 2 cameras, a Cine camera and a Canon camera. Now these are very high-end equipment to use, mainly because with the cameras we have very large format documents, so we'll have a map that could be the size of that little area there. So we have to have a camera that can get up high and take a very good photograph of that. I'm not sure about your collections, whether you'd have documents or maps that, or any sort of document that would go that big, but you have to be aware when you're choosing your equipment of the kind of records you have. You have to be aware of the conservation of the record that you're scanning. So, for instance, photographs, correspondence can go on a flatbed scanner, but if you have volumes, you don't want to squish those down on a flatbed scanner. You really need an overhead camera. But look, a lot of the scanners that you get today that are quite reasonably priced, they're also good now, so you don't have to outlay an enormous amount of money on a very good quality scanner. And a lot of the cameras, they're reasonably priced these days. You don't have to go out and buy that Cine camera, which is very high-end and used in like the archives, the National Library and that, unless you had large format documents. But you need to be aware of the records and their safety. That's how you scan them. Certainly not those feed-through scanners, they're out. These are some of the records that we digitise. We've got documents, photographs, plans, and very topical at the moment, that's the Queen when she was out here many, many years ago. Yeah, so a large variety of documents. So some of those would have been done on a flatbed scanner, the photograph for instance. The plan, that would have been done with an overhead camera because it's very large. Current projects that we've been working on is the 50th anniversary. Now these are all available on our website to look at. The ROTS resumption plans, hotel plans which are available through Archives Investigator, digital gallery, we did a number of series of Sydney Opera House, photograph albums. The first fleet indents will be available on our website in the very near future, and building plans. So that's all probably series based. The Opera House, various series, but theme based as well. Why do we digitise? Access and preservation are the two main reasons, and under access, we and you could enhance access to the collection. So we're making our collection, particularly photographs and plans, more widely available, both nationally and internationally. So it allows a much, much bigger audience, rather than people having to come into your reading room or your society to look at the records. they can view them anywhere in the world, reach an extended audience, and we meet the public's expectation by allowing them to view our records wherever they are. I think we should also add to this list help in identifying photographs, because that's come up very frequently today. And State Records as an organisation has embraced that. On our Archives Outside blog, we actually have a little section called Moments in Time. And weekly we put up a photograph and challenge people to help us to date that photograph or actually put a location to that photograph. And I have to say our regulars get very competitive, very competitive. But when you're getting information from people online, you also need to go back and verify that information, because they could say this is, the rocks or something without any verifying information. But most of the people that do comment on our photographs link to newspaper articles, stuff like that. But you do need to verify the information that a person's giving you. But look, it's wonderful, and as I said, we've embraced it, using it as a tool to identify, date our photographs. Preservation is another reason why we digitise. We preserve the original through giving access to the surrogate. So rather than people coming into our reading room and we issue those original photographs, they now look at the digital copy. So the photographs don't get handled, there's no chance of them getting damaged through handling. So that's preservation. And also it's a record of the conservation on a record, as I've mentioned. And the preventive loss of information. Now that will never happen to you, because Christine's told you about how to store your records so they'll last forever. But it can happen. I mean, if a record has been water damaged or something like that, and there may be treatment that has to occur where information will be lost, you can photograph it before that. Also, you can use digitisation to enhance a very faint document that you can't read, and that actually can bring up that writing so you can read what's there now. That can be used, but that's very intense, high-end digitisation. Yes?
I've also found out with photographs, if you've scanned it, but say a teeny-weeny photo, I've got photos
absolutely.
in the book.
Yes.
And when it's scanned full screen, you can see these German planes.
Absolutely, yes.
And flat.
Yes, so what we do with On Moments in Time, we'll put the small image on, but then we'll give access to a bigger image where people can zoom in and you pick up little signs in the background that you can't see on the original image with the naked eye. So it's great in that respect to really get into an image and find those little details that you can't see with the naked eye. And our aim at State Records is to develop, document, preserve and make available the State Archives collection as a cultural and information resource in order to enrich the people and communities of New South Wales. It's very grand. Our images can be accessed via our website, via Photo Investigator, Archives Investigator, the Digital Gallery. As mentioned, the social networking sites. Flick is wonderful, again, for people commenting on photos, providing information about them. On our blog, as I mentioned, Archives Outside, and also, as Christine mentioned, Picture Australia and the Dictionary of Sydney. A lot of local history societies are on Picture Australia, so it's wonderful to get your photographs out there. So we'll talk about digitising your collection or planning your project. If it's, you haven't got a lot of equipment, the first thing you really need to decide actually is whether you're going to scan in-house or outsource the scanning. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. In-house, you've got control of the project. You don't have to send your records off-site. Your staff get trained to scan records. You keep the costs down. Again, but then you've got your initial outlay in the equipment. Outsourcing, no outlay, you're just paying for the images to be scanned, but then you haven't got control over the project, so you've really got to be very specific about your technical specifications, about how you want them scanned. And again, you've got to send the records off-site. So you've just got to work out what's going to be best for you. You've got to prioritise your digitisation through your selection. You may have a particular group of records that you think would be of a lot of interest to the community, and do those first rather than other ones that might not be so important. Or you may have some that you can see may need conservation work, and it might be best to digitise those now to preserve them in the state that they are if you can't afford conservation work. You can look at whether they've got to be rehoused or they've got to be reordered, and Christine spoke about that, about putting records in order. So if you need to reorder the records so they make sense. You look at any conservation treatment that needs to be done, and you could probably do that all yourself now through our handy tips. The equipment required, and that relates to whether you're going to do it in-house or outsource. the method, whether you're going to do single pages, double pages, what your specifications and standards will be, which I'll talk about a little bit later, post-production that has to occur, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and also the file storage and management, which we've touched upon about storing in databases, and also the file sizes, because they can get very large for images, very, very large, so it takes up a lot of storage space on anybody's network. The important thing, and I think every institution would agree with this, is you scan, your initial scan, you do it the highest resolution possible for you, and that's called the scan once methodology. So you have that original scan at a very good quality, which means theoretically you shouldn't have to go back and scan that document again because you've done a very high resolution scan in the first instance. And from that master file, which would be a TIFF file, you can then make your derivative copies, like your JPEGs that you might want to post on Picture Australia or on your website. But as I said, the TIFF file is very, very big, so you have to take into consideration how you're going to store that digital master copy. But today you can buy, getting a lot of gigabytes on a computer, it's very cheap. So times have changed and you can do those things. The specifications, you need to look at the resolution. So that's like when people say 600 dpi, 300 dpi, that's the resolution. The colour depth, whether you want it bitonal, grayscale or full colour, and the file type, a TIFF file, a JPEG, that's what we're talking about when we mention those terms. So the image resolution describes the amount of detail contained within an image. So that's when I was saying you have a 600 dpi, that's a very high resolution scan, so it picks up more detail, then 300, 150, and you get down that way. It's the density of the pixels, and I'll show you an example in a moment. It should be the next one. Yeah. So you can see the difference. In the difference, it's PPI, DPI, same thing. And the difference, importantly to note, in the file size, 109 compared to 6 for the different resolutions. So that's something to consider when you're determining what resolution you want to scan your images at. Yes?
Would you say that a lower resolution would be okay just for a document like a
Oh, absolutely. Look, 150 is fine. That's fine. Yes?
Printing, the right resolution for printing is 300 dpi.
That's correct, yeah, for a good quality print. We scan at 600 to create that very good master file. I mean, that's our preference. Look, 300 is perfectly acceptable. It's perfectly acceptable to scan at that. It's just as long as you get that very good master copy, so you keep that and then you can create your derivatives off that. So 300 is perfectly acceptable. 150 as well. So usually 75 is for web delivery. So, you don't want to put something like 109 megabytes on a web page and takes, crashes computers and downloading and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Depends on the size image you want.
It does depend on the size image too. And look, if for printing purposes, we put 75 on our website, and if you print off that, they're perfectly good quality prints of that. We have a 600 JPEG, which that's if somebody orders an image off us that they see online, that's what we would send to them on a disc, so they could do print off or do what they wish with. So yeah, I mean, look, the scanners are so good these days that a low resolution is still going to get you a good scan. But just for that archival master one, you probably need to consider maybe 300, and then you can create your derivatives off that by compression.
Excuse me.
Yes.
You're speaking about photographs. And
Yes.
If say you want to scan a document,
With
you could have a lower resolution.
Yeah, like a handwritten letter.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And you could do that in black and white, which again will reduce the file size. I mean, photographs can be done, obviously they're not colour. Yes.
What about, we found something in our archives the other day that was the old-fashioned way, how they used to write and then they used to cross it and write on the back as well.
Right.
How do you treat that so that you can actually read it?
Photoshop.
Very
Photoshop, yeah.
Well, there's that.
the cross-writing, the way it brings it.
Look, that way you can probably do 2 scans, one where, that writing's brought out and one where it's not. Yeah, that would be the only way around that, unfortunately. But we have that on our records as well with convict documents. They're scribbled across, the writing's all across. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of those kind of records. A lot of this, the resolution and everything, you get the software like Photoshop or that, and you put all that in as you do the scan. You can change the DPI, the colour, whether you want black and white. That's all done at the time of scanning within the software. And you can look at the file size and think, oh no, that's going to be too big, so you just reduce the DPI as you're doing the scan. The bit depth is, you've heard of 1 bit, 8 bit, 60, and that's just the shades. And there you see the difference of how it looks. There's not a lot of difference between 4 and 8, so whereas 1's a bit sort of dodgy. But as I said, within the software you can make all those selections to suit your purposes and how you want that image to look. Again, this is talking about the colours, the 24-bit colour image. Compression is when we compress an image, so you have lossless or lossy. And you do that again through the software, so you compress it TIFF down to a JPEG. So that's the difference there. That also affects the file size as well. So there are a number of things that affect the file size. But really to the naked eye, when you look at these, the difference is minimal. So it's very hard to see a difference. So that's what you were talking about, the writing across the documents, yeah. Even just in our reading room, if someone wants to get a reader printer, I know what we do. We'll sometimes make it dark so that writing across shows, and then take it back lighter so you can read the writing underneath. Yeah, true. They had scribbled across letters. And that's just the different file formats. You've got your TIFF, which is usually your master one. We use a TIFF and a JPEG, but then you've got your GIFs and your and JPEG 2000. We use TIFFs and JPEG, and we compress to a JPEG. That's what we use, but there are many options there. It's just what suits your purposes. Digital asset management. So you can retrieve your image, like giving your image a name. So with our file naming scheme, we went with the Library of Congress. So as I said, we will pick a series, a photograph series, and so that series will have an NRS number 123. So we will name that image 123-0001, and that's the sequential number at the end, so it'll go 1, 2, 3. That'll make it distinct from the next image. So you have to give it an individual digital ID, we call it, but that ID has to somehow mean something to you so you know what that image is from. It really just depends on how you want to do that. Keywords, again, that's to use for if you're putting your images on Picture Australia, because they use the Dublin core metadata schema, and this would come from within if you had a database, and they harvest from that, and they require keywords for retrieval. So the Australian Pictorial Thesaurus is very, very good for standard keywords for a photograph, like subject terms really, keywords, subject terms. File storage, as we've said, hard drive, DVD, USB stick, but your storage is the important thing in relation to the file sizes that you've created. So you have to know what capacity of storage you have on your computer systems. But as I said, you get massive amounts of storage these days for very little cost. Again, Christine's mentioned backup migration. It's all to do with, technology becoming obsolete, and I mean that's an issue facing all institutions, large ones, small ones, about how that's all going to work. DVD, look, it still has its place, storing them on DVD, but again, you'd have to have a sort of a mechanism in place, maybe once a year go back and check that they were still opening and something like that. So we, at State Records, we're on hard drive. We keep ours on a hard drive, and we have backup systems in place to do that. Metadata, as Christine's mentioned many times, it provides context to an image. So we have a caption, that's metadata, the title of that photograph. The digital ID, that's the ID assigned to that digital file, which is our record series, our job number, the original location, it's rather long, I know, the original location that it came from, and that sequential number at the end. The date of the photograph, the format, the size, that had no original number, some photographs do, and the series number that it came from. So we can look at that photo and know what series it came from and what other photos belong with that. That's based, as I mentioned, on the Dublin core metadata schema, which is the most universally accepted for web discovery. if people are searching for photographs on the web and you've got those formats in there, hopefully pick up yours. We don't show our keywords, that's hidden in the background and they just get picked up as in the search. Keeping archives. So are there any questions? I know I went very quick, but time is of the essence here, I think. Yes.
We're considering outsourcing our digitization.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about?
Look, there are a number of very good external vendors available. What you need to do is with your specifications. Are you talking about photographs or what sort of records? Documents? Yeah, you just need to say what resolution you want them scanned at, what file format you want. So you would be definitely wanting a TIFF version and then compressed down to a JPEG version if that's what you wanted. You definitely request the 2 file formats and also the specification, the DPI that you wanted. So with documents, 300's high, anything under that will be fine.
So,
Yeah.
do you know how I can find out who these people are and how to choose one and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
We would
We-
suggest that you advertise. We can't recommend.
Mm.
It can't be
We should
snubbed.
advertise.
Well, I think either do it through.
Yeah,
There are a number of. I mean, you could either through your own collaboration with other societies. I would do that. There are quite a few players in the field, but you only just have to talk to people from other societies, and they'll tell you who they've used. That word of mouth is the best way.
But yeah, the ones out there are good.
Can I just ask about
Yes.
the maps? When you were talking
Yes.
about, maps
Yes,
this
yes,
side
yes.
and the overhead camera,
Yes.
is that something that's a fixture to a ceiling, or is it somebody using a camera?
Oh no,
a
it's
ladder or
the
something?
one that we have is fixed to a arm, so to speak.
Okay.
So it can move up and down.
Right.
But look, we have ones in our reading room at Kingswood, and they're about that high. It's attached to an arm, and they're just like a Canon camera. So you can get those small ones like that, and that arm just rotates up and down. And I mean, large formats like that, obviously, we couldn't do in the reading room, but they do up to over A3 by
Right.
taking it up and that, so you can get that sort of stuff, yeah. But the Cinar is very high end and specialised, but you can get them for small purposes.
Could I just ask, were you implying that DVDs are less likely to last longer than USB?
Oh no, not at all. I'm just saying if you haven't got a large storage capacity on your network and you needed to take some images off the network for a period of time to increase that, you could put them on DVB, but no way are they there forever. Just as a sort of a stopgap measure, you could do that.
And how long do USB sticks be?
Oh,
I don't know.
no, I don't think anybody
Does
really-
anyone?
No,
No,
does
it's
anybody
really
know?
no.
And I mean, you
So it's
know,
under 10 years or something?
yeah, under 10
No, I
years.
was
so-
just wondering whether it's better to put on USB or DVD.
Well, look, I would suggest
Both.
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 You both, definitely.
Many.
You can never
Plus-
have too many
Plus
copies.
an external hard
Plus-
drive. Yeah, all
Yeah.
of those things.
Yes.
Because
The conventional allows only about 7 years for DVD.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
And you run that risk. There's an example in, I think it's in Keeping Archives, where someone's used a post-it note,
yes,
evil
yes,
things,
yeah,
and put them on a DVD
Yeah.
and damage
Yeah.
the DVD.
yeah. So with anything, I mean, there's going to come a point where it's no longer going to last. But various copies at a few locations.
And backing up and backing,
Backing
up.
up,
again.
backing up, yeah.
Now, what I'm going to talk about is developing an access policy document. You've got a handout in your folder, but this is the kind of thing that a big archive like State Records, a state library, and I dare say many other groups will have a policy document about access. And again, it does sound a bit bureaucratic, but it's important to have those sorts of things documented, because you end up that there's someone there on the Saturday and in comes the local journalist and they want to have access to everything, they want to photocopy everything, they don't want to pay, they don't care about copyright. I hope no one here's a journalist. So it's important to have that, and that's the kind of a project too that's wonderful for a working party. If you've got a group of people in your society, and I mentioned we are mostly all societies run by volunteers. People love a project like that because they can get a copy from someone else, they can get a copy from state records, any of our documents, they're all in the public domain, you're most welcome to use them. Not saying they're perfect. Things like that are ways that you can then have a system in place. That forms part of your procedure manual. Just as we talked about all the other processes, about the building, accessioning the records, arranging and describing, this weird word about series and context. We've got documentation about digitisation, about databases, all of those kinds of things. They form part of your procedure manual, your management document, as does this. So what we need to do is develop a document which basically says it's tailored to your institution and it defines the framework of access, simply as that. Every policy is going to be different. So what we need to think about, clientele, who is going to be using the records. Now that also is not meant to be ageist, but if you've got people that you know who are going to be coming in using the collection, are they going to be struggling with this wonderful WizBut database that you've developed using Tabularium or some other software on this absolutely fantastic Apple computer that the local Historical Society was able to buy with some funding? And are they really going to be able to grapple with looking at all these images online with using bifocal glasses? So that is an issue. Are we talking about access? Are we talking about providing access to surrogates, that is a copy? Are we going to be thinking about providing access to the original record? So you need to think about that and think about who is going to be viewing it. It's important to think about equality of access. This is an issue for us at State Records, but equally for you. If you're a society which is encouraging people to come and use the collection, there is a question of equality. So you might have a pensioner rate or a seniors rate for photocopying, that's fine, but do you document that? Do you have a normal rate for those who don't have concession cards? Do you say, look, anyone can come in as long as they wash their hands, they use a pencil, pencils only? Why do we say pencils only? I didn't mention this before. Why do we say this?
Biros can make marks that go right through paper.
They sure can. Now, State Records makes you use a pencil in the reading room. There is nothing wrong with asking people to use a pencil. Use a pencil when you're making any annotations, any marks on the material in your collection. You might be collating it so that it can be digitised. If you're going to write page numbers on there, write them in pencil. Pencil can be rubbed out, biro can't. Levels of access. So you may well be saying, well, okay, for certain categories of records, we need to have someone sit down, not because there's anything particularly sensitive in the records, but because the records themselves are a little bit complex. Are there any restrictions? Fragility is one of the restrictions. Is the format of the record a giant plan that's 6 feet long, 2 metres long? Is that going to be a problem? Then we think about legislation. That's less of an issue for you, but you do have to think about depositors, and you need to think about the sensitivity or confidentiality of the records. The other thing to consider is the protection of individual privacy. Privacy legislation applies to government records, but there are general issues about what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. A general rule of thumb is, I suspect that with most records, if you're at all concerned, err on the side of caution, but you need to negotiate that with your donor, irrespective of who the donor is. The control over the holdings. One would hope that you have good control over the collection, but the policy should certainly inform the control over the records. The physical condition, as I've mentioned, fragility can be an issue. The security. So if you've got an access policy, the access policy should be that people don't just come in with a key and use the records on a Sunday evening, that they use the records when there is someone from the society, a member of the society, a volunteer with that designated role who's there. Because access, I have to say, is a point of weakness in terms of your security. If you've got an absolutely wonderful collection of antique postcards, highly pinchable, you've got to be careful about things like that. And we do it ourselves at State Records with something which has not only high information value, but which has an intrinsic value, that you might have a system in place where you issue the 2 or 3 to the person, but you're with them and they give them back to you and you mark them back. But you explain to the person, you say, this is our process for postcards because of the value of them. And they're the sort of thing that you might also think about with your collection. When you get your collection assessed, it's always hard to value collections. You certainly can't value archives with any degree of accuracy. But certain things like postcards with stamps are incredibly valuable. So if you've got postcards that have got the original postage stamp on them, quite valuable. Likewise, other material that you've probably got. So you need to think about that, and that's one of the things too to think about with insurance. Most of you will have insurance through the RAHS to cover the situation if someone falls over and hurts themselves, but think about the insurance over the collection. You do need to consider that because that is important, and one way of ensuring that you're managing that is by the way that you provide access. Think about fees. What is a reasonable fee? Maybe not to charge to come in, although a lot of societies do. They say free to members, however much for non-members, and think about fees for copying. Think about the level of reference services. Is the society in a position to be able to provide reference services, advice about the collection? Most societies are, so therefore you promote that. Because all of these things can be used not as negatives, and they're not meant to be used that way. They're meant to be used as as showing that you're a professionally run and a professional organisation. You have an access policy. You say, we have all these things in place. We have fees. With the way that we use, most societies have to provide an annual report. We use the fees to embark on a digitisation program, or that we use it to develop a database, or we do something else with it. We do provide reference services. So you make these things positives. It's about marketing. So things that are important and the way that the procedures that you do them, you don't say they're a don't. It's not about the glass being half empty. It's about the positives, because that's what makes you a positive and a professional organisation. It's not that, yes, you've got all these things. Christine told us we had to do this, that and the other thing. Yes, all those things are good practice, but in the end, they're what get you the grants, the sponsorship, the local support, community support. People say that's a well-run organisation. They aren't going to say it's all bureaucratic and everything else, because when people see it works to their advantage, they don't. So at that point, I'm going to finish because we've just reached 1:30, because I hope there might be a few more questions. Yes?
Is there a model policy that we can use to sort of...
Yes, I can get a copy of that for you, yeah, for sure. There's a lot of things in the back of the wonderful book. For $95, you also get a DVD in the back that has all of the appendices. But in the body of the publication, it makes reference to a lot of the appendices which are on the DVD, and they are things you can download. So there are policies, documents there. If you, I know because I know you'll know me, email me about that and I can give you something there.
Yeah, just regarding insurance, how often do you believe there should be evaluation done to support the insurance policy?
I think it's what the insurance company asks for, to be honest. Look, if your collection changes, if you've taken in a lot more material, I mean, collections of papers from the local surf club probably don't have a huge intrinsic value, but if among them they have some objects, some ephemera, some beautiful invitations and things like that, then think about it. The other thing too, I mean, with all of it, it really is talking to your insurance. If your collection as a whole changes, then consider it. But once you've got insurance, just keep it rolling over.
The council, in fact, insures our collection.
Oh, well.
And they self-insure, right?
Yes.
So
Oh, you're fine then, you don't have to worry. It's more, it really is about that whole thing about thinking about the value. It's because sometimes within collections, I mean, they have it has incredible local value, which is very hard, very, very hard to put a value on. But you often will have, clothing has quite a value, you know, antique, you know, vintage clothing as they call it, has a huge value. And other objects, you know, there's less of a market these days for antiques, but they still have a value. Things with stamps have a huge value. Postcards. So you all go back now home and look at your collection. Are there any stamps there? Postcards. And that's why knowing your collection, so having that documentation about what's there, very, very important. Any other questions? Yes?
Yes, one thing that I've discovered with community organisations, they're not always upgrading their insurance from year to year. It's very important to make sure you're adequately insured.
Always.
There was one organisation that I had a little bit to do with, it's more on the historic Norwich, but I did teach there many years ago, and they had a disastrous fire, and they did not have enough to rebuild.
Yes, that's right.
Because
You do.
they were underinsured.
Yeah, I know, and it becomes a cost. But of course, that's part of what you're using some of your fees for, is to put things towards insurance. I mean, you get a good rate through the group insurance through the RAHS, so that's something to consider. They are all important things to take account of. Any other last questions? Well, please do the evaluations. That really will be helpful for us. And please join us for a quick sandwich. Thank you very much.